Everyone knew that Luke was head over heels in love with me. To propose, he rented an entire yacht and set off fireworks all night long, broadcasting our happiness to the whole world. My adoptive parents, who treated me like their own daughter, even gave me company shares as a wedding gift. My beloved sister personally carved a pair of jade pendants, wishing Luke and me a lifetime of happiness together. But I killed them all. I plunged the knife into Luke's heart, cut open my sister's belly, and gouged out my adoptive parents' eyes. As I watched them suffer, I laughed maniacally at the camera. The whole world witnessed my heinous act. When the police arrived, I was tearing the share certificates my parents had given me into pieces, letting them fall into the pools of blood. The world seemed to be drenched in crimson. One female officer couldn't handle the scene and threw up on the spot. But I didn't stop. Instead, I laughed even more hysterically. The police rushed forward, shouting, "Put your hands down. Turn around." They quickly subdued me, but by then, no one at the scene had survived. Online, public opinion exploded. People were outraged. Has Miss Sarah gone insane? Mr. Luke loved her so much and planned such an elaborate proposal. How could she be so cruel and kill him? Yes, and not just Mr. Luke, she killed her parents too. Her parents treated her so well. They never discriminated against her for being adopted. They even just gave her company shares. How could she be so ungrateful? Exactly. How could she be so cruel to the adoptive parents who treated her like their own? And her sister even personally made her an engagement gift. How could she treat her sister so brutally? The police thought I had lost my mind. After all, how could any sane person commit such an atrocious act? Get yourself together, one officer scolded. These were your parents, sister, and boyfriend. How could you do this to them? Are you even human? I smiled at the older officer and said, yes, I am human. A very sane one at that. Would an insane person be able to send them to hell so precisely? I'm the killer. The whole world watched me commit these crimes. You can arrest me now. I pointed at the bodies on the ground and continued, I killed Luke, who was proposing to me. I killed my beloved sister whom I cherished since childhood. And I killed my adoptive parents who treated me like their own. I'm guilty. What I've done is unforgivable. As I spoke, I smiled at the camera that was still recording. The police noticed and quickly cut the feed. Several female officers were discussing amongst themselves. This case is too shocking. She recorded the whole thing, killed so many people in such a brutal way, and they were all her closest family members. Yes, when we got the murder report, we couldn't believe it. On my way here, I looked her up. The killer's name is Sarah Quinn. She was adopted by the Quinn family, and they treated their adopted daughter extremely well. Designer bags, jewelry, all top quality. They even treated her better than their own daughter, and her boyfriend was completely devoted to her. Everyone knows how intensely he pursued her this past year. Tonight he even set off fireworks all night for his proposal. Maybe Sarah's gone mad? Otherwise, how could she harm people who loved her so much, and in such a cruel way? True, I've never seen such brutal murder methods since I joined the force. The older officer heard the female officers chatter and reprimanded them. Stop speculating at a crime scene. You're police officers, not gossiping housewives. He then turned to me and said, Sarah, my name is Frank. You can call me Officer Frank. Why did you kill a family that was so good to you? Tell me the truth, I can help you. When I heard those words, I smiled. For so many years, I had longed for someone like this to appear, someone who could pull me out of the abyss. But no one ever did. I looked up at Officer Frank resolutely and said, I'm guilty. I killed people. Officer Frank, please arrest me. I smiled and held out my hands. Officer Frank was taken aback. Don't you have anything to say? I shook my head. He seemed to want to say something more, but instead just put the handcuffs on me. Take her to the station, Officer Frank called out. I cooperated fully and obediently got into the police car. On the way, I heard Officer Frank on the phone, this Sarah Quinn. She doesn't seem like someone who would commit such horrible crimes. Could there be mental health issues? Have a psychiatrist ready at the station when we arrive. I still can't believe a girl like this would commit such a brutal crime. Hearing this, I gave a self-mocking smile. Mental illness, how I wished I really had been mentally ill. Then I would have snapped and attacked them long ago, instead of waiting until now. At the police station, when I was taken to an interrogation room, someone was already waiting for me. The person wore a white coat. I knew this must be the psychiatrist mentioned in the phone call. As soon as I entered, his gaze fixed on me and didn't leave. He was studying me. I smiled and said, You're the psychiatrist here to evaluate my mental state, right? I'm afraid you've wasted your trip. I'm not mentally ill. He didn't believe me and smiled, saying, Mental patients generally don't admit they're mentally ill. I laughed. So you think I'm mentally ill? We'll know after the test. Please cooperate, Miss Quinn. I nodded and complied with everything. To everyone's surprise, I truly wasn't mentally ill. Officer Frank asked incredulously, should we test again? The psychiatrist shook his head and left. Officer Frank came in then, looking at me with complex emotions. Is someone forcing you? Tell me, I can help. I smiled and shook my head. No one forced me. I killed them because they deserved to die. Hearing this, Officer Frank gave me a piercing look. Deserved to die? But weren't they your closest family? I paused. Closest family? Were they really my closest family? Perhaps they once were. Seeing my silence, Officer Frank changed tactics. You were adopted by your parents, right? I nodded. Did your parents treat you badly? I countered. What defines good treatment? Buying me beautiful clothes? Buying me million-dollar jewelry? Taking me to high-end beauty salons for treatments? If these count, then I suppose they treated me well. Officer Frank was taken aback by my response and said, of course these count as good treatment. If they didn't care about you, why would they spend money on you? I was silent for a moment, then suddenly nodded. Then let's say it was good. Officer Frank continued, what about your relationship with your sister? Were you jealous that she was the Quinn's real daughter? I shook my head. I never cared about being the Quinn's real daughter. Whether others believe it or not, I never envied that position. I didn't envy her, I actually treasured her. From childhood, my parents told me to protect my sister. Whenever she was bullied, I was always the first to defend her. Officer Frank was confused by my words but pressed on, what about your boyfriend? Was there love between you? Love? Officer Frank's question made me think. Was there? He rented a yacht for the proposal, set off fireworks across the city. Did that count as love? I gave a self-mocking laugh. Officer Frank, do you think they really treated me well? Officer Frank became angry at this. What do you think? Isn't this good treatment? Your lifestyle is something many people can only dream of. Having a family that treasures you so much isn't easy to come by. Oh, it wasn't easy. They pretended for so long that they fooled everyone. At first, I also thought my parents truly cared about me. Sometimes I even felt incredibly lucky to have such wonderful parents. Even though they had my sister after adopting me, they never reduced their love for me. Sometimes they treated me even better than her. The neighbors all said these adoptive parents were one of a kind. But do such perfect adoptive parents really exist? Everything seemed too good to be true. Should this kind of perfect goodness be preserved forever? Such wonderful people, wouldn't they only truly belong to me if they were dead? So on the day of the proposal, I smiled as I accepted Luke's engagement ring. I happily received the blessings from my parents and sister. They all presented their carefully prepared gifts for me. Everything seemed to point to the beautiful life ahead of me. But suddenly I felt this happiness was too fleeting. How wonderful it would be if it could last forever. I secretly slipped the sedative I'd been carrying into their drinks. I watched as they gradually lost strength and became paralyzed. I knew it was time to begin the celebration. Let them watch. Clearly, this was my thank you gift to them. Thank you for treating me so well all these years. I thought that since they loved me so much, they would surely appreciate my gift. I approached my sister first. I had always loved her the most since childhood, so naturally, I should start with her. Since everyone was going to witness this beautiful moment, her child shouldn't be left out. I needed to let it come out early to witness this moment. I gently cut open my sister's clothes, my eyes lingering on her belly. Seeing my cold gaze, my sister burst into tears. Sister, what are you doing? I'm your beloved sister. I smiled at her. Sister, this is for your own good. Let your child come out early to witness today's beauty. Don't you like that? Without waiting for her response, without any hesitation, a child appeared in my hands. Oh, looks like it's a boy. Sister, do you want to see? I dangled the child in front of her face. But why isn't he crying? Could he be dead already? I tossed the child towards our parents. I walked over to them too. Mom, Dad, you must be heartbroken seeing your own grandson like this. Let me help you. With one move, their eyes bloomed with red flowers. There, now you can't see anymore. I smiled carelessly as they clutched their eyes and screamed in pain. I turned indifferently to Luke. Luke, your little nephew is gone. Are you sad? Luke looked at me in shock. How could you do this to your sister? Oh, why are you so agitated? Or is there something you want to tell me? Luke noticed my gaze and kept shaking his head. No, nothing. I cut him off. Didn't you say you loved me more than anything? I could never find a way to verify that before. Now I have a method. Let's look inside and see. I gently touched his chest and said, let's see who really lives here. With a squelching sound of flesh being cut open, I stirred around a few times and said, would you like to see too? Then I held Luke's heart in front of his eyes. I examined his heart repeatedly in front of him. They say when you meet someone you love, your heart beats, but the heart in my hand isn't beating, so this heart doesn't love me. If it doesn't love me, then let's throw it away. I casually tossed it aside and stepped on it. Such a true heart, even dogs wouldn't want it. I looked at the others. My sister had already bled to death, leaving only our blind parents. I'll be merciful one last time. I'll send the whole family to reunite properly. Without hesitation, I slashed their throats. Blood gushed out instantly. Beautiful. Seeing me remain silent, Officer Frank slammed the table. Since you know they loved you so much, why did you kill them? Don't you have a heart? I looked up at Officer Frank. I don't have a heart. I killed them. I'm guilty. I deserve to die. Just sentence me. These words made Officer Frank's face darken further. What kind of attitude is this? Are you mocking the police? Tell the truth, you still have a chance. I laughed bitterly. Chance? Do I still have any chances? Officer Frank looked at me and sighed, speaking more gently. Sarah, I have a daughter about your age. At your age, you should be carefree. What made you do these things? Tell me, I can help you. I looked up and saw something different in Officer Frank's eyes. I saw his love for his daughter. Suddenly, I felt envious. Why didn't I have such a good father? The person before me might genuinely want to help, but it was too late now. I wondered if things would have been different if I had met a police officer like him before. I looked up at Officer Frank and asked, what time is it? Officer Frank looked at me strangely but checked his watch. Almost noon. Ah, it's time. I smiled at Officer Frank. Officer Frank, let me give you a gift. Just as Officer Frank was puzzled, a female officer rushed in anxiously. Officer Frank, there's been an explosion at the Quinn house. We've investigated. Several people who had business dealings with the Quinns were killed in the basement, but everyone else in the villa was safe. After hearing this, Officer Frank looked at me furiously. Is this your gift? I nodded. Isn't it? I was worried Mom and Dad would be lonely, so I specially arranged for some business partners to join them. I suddenly burst out laughing, but as I laughed, tears rolled down my face. Seeing me like this, Officer Frank frowned. He knew this wasn't as simple as it appeared. What will it take for you to tell the whole truth? I looked at Officer Frank with a bitter smile. Does the truth matter? Officer Frank nodded solemnly. Perhaps it was time. I said, all right, I can tell you everything, but I have one condition. What condition? I want to live stream. I want everyone to know the truth. Officer Frank paused after hearing this. After all, it wasn't standard procedure. After long deliberation, he nodded. He had someone set up a phone in front of me and started the live stream. Go ahead, speak. I looked at the screen. It was filled with abuse directed at me. I began speaking. I killed them because they didn't deserve to be human. They all deserved to die. Comments started scrolling across the screen. Your parents adopted you, and instead of being grateful, you say they don't deserve to be human? Maybe they shouldn't have adopted you in the first place. Yes, and you say your parents deserve to die? I think you're the one who deserves to die. Right, and your boyfriend who loved you so much, who gave you such an extravagant proposal, you killed him. Do you even have a heart? Heart? My heart died long ago. I slowly removed my top. My body was covered in horrifying scars. I smiled at them. Is this the adoption you're talking about? Would you want this kind of adoption? Are all these scars their love? At first, I also had illusions. I thought being adopted was a blessing. They were truly good to me at the beginning, but I didn't know all this goodness came at a price. Before every gathering they took me to, they would specially order custom dresses for me, $1,000,000 jewelry. They would take me for body treatments beforehand. Everyone thought they were good to me. After all, even their own daughter, my sister, didn't get this treatment. But do you know why they did all this? At this point, the live stream comments suddenly stopped. The police officers present were all looking at me. They had guessed it, but couldn't believe it. I continued quietly. Their adoption was my descent into hell. All the beauty you saw was just a cover for their unspeakable secrets. If you want this kind of adoption, I can give it to you. What's even more ridiculous is that even Luke's proposal was just part of their game. Do you know? I never imagined my world could be so dark. I laughed laughed self-mockingly, then looked at Officer Frank. Officer Frank, do you know how I spent those days? Officer Frank shook his head, his eyes flashing with sympathy. I spoke, my tone flat. Every time, they would dress me up like a little princess. They created an illusion for everyone. This was how they best concealed their true faces. To outsiders, I was fortunate I had a loving family, a devote to outsiders. I seemed fortunate I had a loving family and a devoted boyfriend. But when the gatherings ended, when only their conspiring group remained, they showed their true nature. They were demons. Do you understand? I looked up at them, giving a bitter smile. By now, they were too shocked to speak. I continued without acknowledging them. In that life, I thought about dying, but I never succeeded because they wouldn't let me escape so easily. Rich people's games aren't something you can choose not to play. I held up my arms, showing the scars on my wrists, horrifying to look at. I smiled bitterly at everyone. Comments scrolled across the screen. This is too disgusting. They adopted someone just to satisfy their inhuman desires? Oh God, if this is true, they really deserve to die. Yes, I feel sick just thinking about it. Looking at these comments, I smiled. Sure enough, when these things were revealed, no one could remain calm. I continued, yes, I thought they deserved to die too, but I had no way to fight them. They were all prominent figures. They were so high above while I was just an insect. I'll never forget how they laughed so brazenly. They were humans, but at that moment they didn't deserve to be. Do you understand my desperation then? I really hated them. I wanted them dead. These days continued endlessly. What would you have done in my place? My question silenced everyone. They didn't dare imagine. Officer Frank looked at me with complex emotions, and some female officers were even crying. I knew everything I said made them start to sympathize with me. The comments also changed to expressions of sympathy for my unfair treatment. I continued speaking, but you know what? This wasn't even true desperation. I laughed bitterly. True desperation was when they gave me hope, then destroyed it themselves. Luke was once my hope for salvation. I naively thought our meeting was fate, that he had genuine feelings for me. He bought me with money. At first, I hated him too in my eyes. Luke was no different from those beasts. I was just their plaything. But Luke really treated me well, and after he came, this family seemed to slowly return to normal. Mom and Dad saw that Luke liked me and thought they could make a bigger profit. They started giving me more freedom, letting me date Luke. Luke would tell the whole world he loved me without hesitation. My life slowly began to have light. I started to trust Luke. I thought everything would get better, and Luke even promised to marry me. At that time, I really thought I saw hope, you know? But why did he have to be so cruel and let me see him in bed with my sister? I stopped and looked at Officer Frank. I heard their conversation too. Want to guess what they said? Officer Frank didn't speak, just asked hoarsely, what did they say? They said it was all a setup, just to make me willingly fall into this relationship. That's when I realized my supposed love was just a betting game among these beasts, betting whether Luke could successfully win me over. And that elaborate proposal you all saw? It was just their moment to verify the result. I finished and looked at Officer Frank with a bitter smile. Officer Frank, what do you think would have happened to me if I hadn't struck first? Officer Frank remained silent, but I noticed his clenched fist. I saw his anger. Yes, any normal person hearing these things would be angry. From the moment I heard those things, I started planning everything for this day. I had actually been setting things up for a while, pretending I knew nothing. I continued being with Luke as usual. I wanted to wait until the proposal day to turn their proud betting game into a joke. Sure enough, on the proposal day, I discovered they had gathered those evil people in the Quinn family basement to watch the outcome of their bet. Only Mom, Dad, my sister, and Luke were on the yacht. They never imagined I would discover everything, so they were completely at ease with me, which gave me the chance to drug them. You might wonder how I got those drugs. Officer Frank followed my words. Because these drugs were once used on you, right? I smiled and nodded. Yes, those were things they used on me. There were plenty in that house. It was actually very simple for me to get them if I paid attention. I was afraid they'd notice, so I only dared hide a little at a time. That day, I poured all the drugs I'd hidden into their wine. After they drank it, they naturally became paralyzed. I wanted to punish them. I wanted to punish them severely, not let a single one escape. As I spoke, I rubbed my stomach. My womb once carried countless little lives too, but they never cared. My children could never survive because of them. Can you understand how I felt at that moment? I really hated them. Why did they do this to me? I couldn't protect my own children. I failed as a mother, didn't I? At this point, I finally broke down crying. The comments were all saying the same thing. Too inhumane, to do such bestial things. People like them don't deserve to live in this world. Yes, people like them don't deserve to live. I had to end their lives with my own hands. I suddenly burst out laughing. Officer Frank looked at me nervously. Are you all right? I shook my head. I'm fine. I haven't finished. I continued speaking. That child my sister was carrying was Luke's. I had always wondered why Luke was chosen to pursue me. Later, I found out it was my sister's idea. She wanted to see if Luke's charm was truly irresistible to all women. Because of their dirty thought, I was set up to give my true heart. I held my head in pain. Officer Frank quickly asked, Sarah, do you need to rest? I shook my head and said, I'm fine. I just hate how blind I was. So from the moment I learned my sister was carrying Luke's child, I had thoughts. Why should their child get to live in this world? I couldn't accept it. I know that child was innocent, but I thought, with parents like them, the child wouldn't turn out well either. So I helped it find peace. As I spoke, I couldn't help but cry, because I still had a conscience that was still a little life after all. Hearing me say this, Officer Frank asked, what about the others? I smiled bitterly and said, I gouged out my parents' eyes because I thought their world was too dirty, they'd be better off not seeing anymore. If they couldn't see, they couldn't harm this world anymore. As for Luke, he kept swearing his love was true. Of course I had to dig at his heart and see for myself. I smiled as I spoke, but then started crying. I touched my stomach and began hitting it hard. And his spawn shouldn't be allowed to live either. Officer Frank noticed something from my behavior and rushed over. But it was too late. I had used too much force, and by the time he saw, blood was already running down my legs. The live stream was urgently stopped, and I was rushed to the hospital. When I woke up the next day, I saw Officer Frank standing guard nearby. Seeing me awake, Officer Frank said, the baby is gone. I smiled at Officer Frank. Good. The last of their evil spawn is gone too. Officer Frank looked at me for a long time before finally asking, so how did you remotely arrange for those people who had wronged you to die in the explosion? It was simple. They were already gathered to watch my misery. The Quinn family basement, where all the sin began, should also be where it ended. I had planted timed explosives long ago. Officer Frank looked at me, seeming to want to say something. I looked up at him. Officer Frank, I only wanted those who hurt me to pay the price. I wouldn't do anything to innocent people. I understand many people are helpless victims. Officer Frank understood these words and nodded helplessly. Officer Frank wanted to say more, but I interrupted him. I smiled at him and sincerely said, thank you. The villa explosion had many loose ends if investigated deeply. I couldn't let those who helped me be implicated. All the sins should be borne by me alone. Officer Frank, everything was done by me. My guilt is undeniable. Judge me as you see fit, I accept it all. After I said this, Officer Frank stared at me intently. After a long while, he asked, why didn't you report to the police in the beginning? Hearing this, I laughed mockingly. Officer Frank, if I had told you about this back then, would you have believed me? In everyone's eyes, they were so good. Who could have imagined their hidden crimes? These words made Officer Frank's expression change. Yes, who would have believed it? If this incident hadn't been so big and drawn so much attention, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Add to that those people's status, and everything would have been swept under the rug. In the end, I would probably just have been locked in a room and beaten. Officer Frank understood now. I had wanted the police to save me, but I was also desperate because their disguise was too perfect. He suddenly felt somewhat guilty and unconsciously lowered his head. Seeing Officer Frank like this, I spoke softly, Officer Frank, this has nothing to do with you. You don't need to feel guilty. It was their fault. Officer Frank lowered his head even more. After a long silence, he uttered 3 words, I'm sorry. He was apologizing on behalf of all police officers. I understood. He said sorry because some things couldn't be brought to light without extreme measures. That's why I ultimately chose such a tragic approach. I looked firmly at Officer Frank. Officer Frank, I did all this. Since I decided to do it, there's no need for sorry. A month later, the case went to trial. Countless people came to watch. Everyone was speaking up for me, saying those people deserved their fate. I smiled. Finally, this time, people stood by my side. I didn't care about the outcome from start to finish. I just wanted those people to pay the price. Before I did this, I had already accepted the consequences. Trading my life for theirs was worth it to me. I successfully exposed their years of crimes to the public. I was content. In court, many people pleaded for leniency for me. Many girls like me were discovered because of me. They cried and begged the judge. I smiled watching them. I willingly accepted all the guilt. I quietly waited for the judge to announce my fate. The outcome I had long known was coming: death penalty. But I had no fear, because the truth had been revealed to everyone. So many girls like me were saved. I won this case. Everyone looked at me with sorrow in their eyes, and I smiled. This time, I smiled sincerely, because I knew that at this moment, I could finally let go.